Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing At the Sound of a Bell by Pavlov's dog.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So I'm not gonna play this out like I didn't do a mistake, but yes, I didn't post any videos for the past 2 days, so today we're getting a triple release day. And of course the reason I did it is because I had a throat virus. I basically lost the ability to speak. I regained it only yesterday, and fortunately we were able to even have a very successful live stream in which I actually talked. So anyway, this is the album today, and here's some of my favorite bits from this album. So for everyone who already knows this album in advance, you're probably now asking yourself, geez Naomi, what is this one doing here? Like, why is it on the list? And honestly, now after I've finished listening to it, I can definitely understand where you're coming from, but rest assured there is a reason why it made its place on the series. So you see, today's album, called At the Sound of a Bell by the American band Pavlov's Dog, is not one that is known to be very much associated with prog. This one came in 1976 and it's their sophomore album, but the album that predated it just 1 year before, being their debut called Pampered Mania that came out in 1975, is considered to be one of the strongest prog debuts to ever come out. Now, the album Pampered Mania and I actually go quite a while back. So I remember back in 2015 when I started discovering prog, I went to the usuals. I started with Pink Floyd, then I remember going to Jethro Tull, and yes, and enjoying all of that. But I remember distinctly one time, this was probably around 2016, where I thought to myself, you know what, I want to listen to some emotional progressive rock. And I didn't really know what I was looking for, but what I did do is I went on to Google and I searched that same thing, emotional progressive rock albums. And Google's results were definitely quite varied, and there was a lot to look at. And I remember going into one forum that might have been the Prog Archives, I just didn't know it back then, and some user left a comment. In it he stated basically a list of a lot of progressive rock albums which he believed to be very emotional, or at least emotionally provoking ones. And well, I don't know, I saw that entire list and then I saw the name Pampered Mania by Pavlov's Dog, and something about that name just kind of jumped in my eyes, and I was like, you know what, I want to listen to this one. So that's exactly what I did. Knowing only a handful of prog acts at the time, the very best well-known ones, I actually went out and searched and listened to this one, which is quite an obscure one to begin with. Now let me rephrase that, as I'm just starting to remember more and more things about it as I speak about it. So I remember that when I actually saw the name for this album, I didn't immediately go ahead and listen to it. I distinctly remember writing it down in my notes on my phone and thinking to myself, I'll get to it in times due. And then some time passed and I remember going to the list and looking, oh, you know what, I want to listen to this one right now. So I sat down and gave it a listen. And right from my initial listening of Pampered Mania was I immediately hooked. And honestly, thinking back at it, I plowed through this one so many times. I listened to it front to back all day long, and that was the only thing I was listening to back then, and I listened to it so much that I kind of just burned out of it after a while, so I gave it a break for a few years, and then I came back to it, let's say around about like 2 years ago, let's say, and I've been enjoying it ever since even more. And really, no matter where I stand with this album today, one thing that I must agree upon is the fact that this album is a hidden gem of prog. Not a lot of people know about this one, yet all of the people who know about this one tend to appreciate it quite highly, and I totally understand why. And when it comes to American prog, it's definitely one of the best albums to come out, even if it's not from one of the best prog bands to originate from the USA. But at the same time, I can definitely understand why people would find this type of music to be fairly obnoxious. And I think that the key word in describing why this album is not the taste of a lot of people comes in the word Surkamp, or more precisely, David Surkamp, who is the vocalist for Pavlov's dog. And his voice is really a hit or miss with a lot of people. I've heard many descriptions of his voice, people stating that he sounds like he's always on helium, or that it's just too high for a man, or that he's always on a constant falsetto, and honestly, I've heard it all, and I get where it's coming from. The main point is, the music is probably objectively very good, but when the voice of David Surkamp is put in front of a lot of people, it just kinda gets frightening, and a lot of people tend to not listen to it. The same sort of problem that sometimes appears with Geddy Lee's vocals on the Rush albums. But personally, I love everything that has to do with his vocals and with the band's music, and the vocals specifically, I just love how, aside from being very high and abnormally high so, they are also very deeply yearning and somewhat screeching with emotion at times, which is just a great effect, which is achieved on the debut album in a lot of instances. And when it came to listening to At the Sound of the Bell, I was pretty much anticipating the same type of vocals and the same type of execution when it comes to the singing. And while in the first track called She Came Shining, I immediately recognized the lovable Surkamp vocals. They were good, and I was maybe a bit over exaggerated by them, because honestly the song itself didn't really feature the same quality music as I got used to all these years from the debut. Because when you start to settle down from the vocals themselves and start listening to actual melodies and rhythms and the overall music, you start realizing the bleak and hard truth. This album, it's not that progressive. Actually, it's not even progressive at all. I've seen many people trying to reason with the fact that songs like Valkyrie or Gold Nuggets are the real progressive gems on here, but honestly, I really don't see that. They just sound bland and still to me, maybe a bit more colorful than the rest, but that you can also find on your generic pop music as well. The only track on here that is somewhat progressive in nature is actually the last track called Did You See Him Cry, and this one, it's genuinely progressive, and when put in the context of a real prog album, it wouldn't really shine that much, but in this one it really does shine. And the question has to be asked, why did this come all the way in the end? It's like the band knew what they were doing. They just created pop music intentionally. I don't like that, because they've given us only a sliver of prog on here, which is good prog, but it's not enough to redeem this album from the misery that it was to sit through it. And the question has to be asked, why did they even lose their progressive persona so quickly? Just last year they've created one of the best debuts in American prog, and this year they've created a shitty pop album. And well, I couldn't find a real answer to it, but my guess would be that it has to do something with record labels and production companies. You see, this is the mid-70s. Prog is starting to see somewhat of a decline, and when it comes to the USA, it's kind of different from the UK. Progressive rock saw even a further decline over there across the pond, so I can only see why a record company for a band like Pavlov's Dog would want them to release something that is a bit more successful, that would ultimately earn them more money, so they went with something more bright, more poppy, and overall less exciting for us prog folk. And aside from just intentionally going in the more popular and more contemporary direction, there's also one thing that one would notice is very much missing on this one, unlike the debut, and that is the violin. The violin, much like a lot of bands that have it as a signature instrument, is missing on here, and the reason for it is because Siegfried Carver, who was the violinist on the debut album, has departed the band. And if there's anything more damning than this, I don't think that I know of it, because in my opinion the most damning thing to have happened in the transition from the debut to the sophomore album was definitely the departure of Carver. His contributions with the violin are just unmatched, and the sound will never be the same without him, and the fact is, it's pretty much sad to listen to Pavlov's Dog without this signature violin sound within them. Now here's an extra surprise for you all just before I end off this review. Do you know who plays the drums on here? Well, a guess is probably and surely one that you were not expecting, because the answer is no other than Bill Bruford. Bill Bruford came to play the drums on here, and honestly it doesn't show at all. It is just abysmal. I have no idea how the same Bill Bruford who just finalized recordings on the King Crimson album Red has came on here and delivered one of the stalest performances I've ever heard him do, but he just managed, and maybe it has to do with the record company and stuff like that, but then why have Bill fucking Bruford on here? I don't know, this album is just all question marks all over, and honestly I don't want to do anything with it anymore, and I think that this will be my last acquaintance with At the Sound of a Bell. So while I might have slightly at least enjoyed this album for it being whatever it is in non-relations to progressive rock, I just don't think that it's really that good, and definitely not redeemable when thinking about the debut. And when looking at the last track, which is a really good prog piece, it just brings down the rating even more, because it shows that they've had it in them for all this time, but they just didn't do anything progressive. It's just a bummer. I don't want to speak about it anymore. Let's move on to talking about this album's cover. So this is a pretty cute cover, and it's pretty straightforward as well. It just shows the big bells, and there's this person, and he's, you know, hanging from the bells, I guess, and it has a lot to do with the original experiments by Ivan Pavlov, which experimented on dogs with bells and food, and yeah, it doesn't really have a lot to do with the music itself though. And while I do like the idea of making this cover in black and white, I do feel like they've kind of messed up the qualities of the contrast, to which point you really can't understand what's going on, especially if you're looking at this one from afar, so it kind of loses the point on that front. But yeah, I much prefer the cover of the debut one with its 100+ drawing by Edwin Landseer. So this one gets a lackluster rating of 5 out of 10, especially when compared to its precursor. But that's about it. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow, because we're going to be listening to A Trick of the Tail by Genesis. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wall, Ristav Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.